Hey guys, how's it going? I'm back here with another video, and today I decided to bring this video which a lot of you guys have requested me to make, and I thought it would actually be interesting. So basically I'm going to be explaining and giving some ideas to what kind of folder structure you might want to use in a NodeJS Express API. So basically, if you're building the backend for an application, you probably want to have it very organized so that not only you can find your code very easily, find bugs, but also so that it looks good, right? It's scalable. You're able to create a project that a lot of people can look at it and say, wow, that looks good, right? So there are many different ways to structure your folders, and there isn't actually a right answer. However, I decided that I would just give my opinions on 3 different folder structures. One is for beginners, like when you're starting out. One is for more intermediate, and another one is for like more advanced, if you want to really scale an application, if you want to build something that is, for example, for a startup, or it's going to be receiving a lot of users, that kind of stuff. Then I'm also going to show that example to you guys. So you can see that the labels for when I talk about each of those are appearing here in the bar, but basically I'm going to start talking about the beginner's folder structure right now. Okay guys, so as you can see right here, I'm inside of my VS Code, and for this video I won't be showing any code actually because it doesn't really matter. The only important thing is the folder structure. I'll try to zoom in here so you guys can take a look. But basically, if you are a beginner, and what I consider a beginner is someone who wants to just create an application which it's going to have a database, it's going to have some endpoints, probably maybe some authentication, right? Different routes, that kind of stuff. This is what I consider. It is probably one of the first projects you want to work in, or actually this might be just a project that you're learning in the first like 2 to 4 months of learning NodeJS and Express, that kind of stuff, right? So how would I structure a beginner's project? Well, over here, as you can see, we have our initial files, we have our yarn, I'm using yarn, but we have our package.json, we have a .env, so even if you're a beginner, I recommend using env variables, environment variables. So I recommend putting your .env file outside of like on the outermost directory, right? Then you're going to have your node modules, and maybe if you're pushing this to GitHub, you might want to add a .git ignore. But again, this is just something that it applies to some cases, right? But then here's where stuff gets interesting. I recommend putting your whole project into a folder called the src folder. If you worked with something like React before, then you're used to this, but src is just a source folder where you're going to contain most of your codes, right? So when you click inside of the src, this is something that you might want to divide. And by the way, I have this cool icons on the side here. This is an extension. I don't remember the name, but I talk about this extension in my video that I'm going to be tagging here at the top. If you want to check it out, I talk about which extension is this, but basically this is why mine looks like this if you're interested. So how exactly does this work? Well, in the src, we're going to have a bunch of folders which we're going to divide our application into, and we're also going to have a file which is going to be actually the starting point of our application. I like to call it index.js, but you can call it app.js or server.js, whatever you want. And it's going to be where you have like the I don't know, const express equals to require express, that kind of stuff. And at the end you'll say something like app.listen, and you'll have the route, and basically this is where your application actually starts, right? But then you're also going to have the routes folder. What exactly is the routes folder? Basically, it is just a folder containing all the different routes you want to have. So basically, if you want to create an endpoint that is for the users, like creating, deleting, updating users, then you might want to create a file just for it. So you'll put all the logic regarding the user over here. But imagine your project might have, you want to create endpoints that are not related to the user. Then you might want to create a file over here related to that specific thing that you want to create. Also, usually if you're having authentication, you might want to have an endpoint just for authentication, where you do all the cool stuff that relates to authentication. You want to create tokens, that kind of stuff. I recommend creating a file separate for all of that because it is a lot of lines of code, so you want to keep your project actually well organized. So basically this is for the routes, but you might also want to have these 3 folders right here. Config, I basically always use configs, a config folder in my applications, and it just stores all the configuration files that I might want to have. For a beginner, probably that's only like setting up your database. So if you have like a MongoDB database, you might want to set it up over here. Or if you're using MySQL, you probably want to set up the information about your database inside of this file, and just at the end export it like this, module.exports, and you can have access to this file wherever you want in your project, right? So this is the idea of what config basically means, and you probably want to have this in the intermediate and advanced as well. But then you also have helpers and models. Basically, if you're using a database and your database requires you to define schemas or define the structure of your tables, then probably you might want to have models. A clear example of this is using MongoDB. If you have a user collection, then you probably want to have a user file over here where you define the collection. So this is the idea of models. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's just for when the database that you're using, the service or the API that you're using to manage your database, if in this case they require you to have and create your schemas on your project, right? And then helpers is something that I really recommend. If you have any files that you want to, it doesn't require, you can write code that doesn't exactly fit specifically for one route or one, I don't know, file, and you want to have access to it in many different files, you might want to have a helper file inside of here. So, for example, if I wanted in my application to calculate, I don't know, calculate the current date, right? Then imagine I want to use this same function that calculates days in many different files, right? So I could come here into my helpers and just create a file called calculateDate.js, and inside of here I could just export export a function that calculate dates, and I can access this function in many different files in my application. It basically is a folder where you can store different files that contain information that may be accessible like within many different parts of your application. So this is actually the structure. Obviously, it's not, you don't have to do it this way. I actually think that a lot of beginners worry a lot about this, and it doesn't really matter at the end of the day, especially if you're a beginner. Probably no one will be looking at your code, so every beginner ends up writing garbage code anyway. So I don't even, like, if you're a beginner, this is my recommendation. This is a pretty nice starting point, but don't worry that much because it might set you back a bit if you're worrying too much about your folder structure. Okay guys, so now we're gonna move into more of the intermediate level project structure. And if you get to this level, then it is better to start dealing with some design patterns, thinking about architectural styles, and choosing kind of a common design pattern that you might want to use in your application. A very common one is called MVC, which stands for models, views, and controllers. But you don't necessarily need to use that. It's just the most common one, I believe. It is also a really nice design pattern. I like to use it when I'm creating a project, for example. And this is how I would actually use this design pattern to create my project structure. So basically, it doesn't change much. The only difference I made here is that, first of all, I decided to make all the folders lowercase because that was kind of annoying me for some reason. But I made everything lowercase, and what I did is basically I let my config folder over here, and I also created an API folder. Why is that? Basically, I like to put all my logic behind, like all my code that actually isn't related to the entry point or configuration or that kind of stuff inside of my API folder, which is actually where my API belongs. So inside of here, I put everything related to routes, controllers, views, that kind of stuff. Not actually views, but like controllers, models, that kind of stuff. And I'm going to show you guys exactly what I put inside of here. So as you can see, this is an example of what I would do. I would create as before, I would have the routes folder, which creates all the routes that we want to have in our application. Then the models, which if you need to create any schemas, you put it over here. And the helpers also keep the same. It's the same idea, right? But then if you're implementing MVC, maybe you want to divide your project in a way so that, for example, when you make an API call, it would be routed to the controllers, and in the controllers you would basically do stuff like validate the data that you're receiving, also point the API call to the specific route that you want to access. And if you're validating data that is coming from the front end, then maybe you want to have a validations folder, which is where I would use something like Yup, which I have a video on, to basically validate that the data that you're receiving is actually the data that you want, right? So this is something important. If you are making an API call and sending the wrong kind of data, then you don't want to actually receive that data because it's not valid, right? So you might want to have some validations in this stage of your development career. So then what you want to do is maybe have a folder for middlewares. I love middlewares. They're very useful. I have a video on middlewares I just made this week, but in a beginner level, I don't find them as useful as an intermediate level, so you'll probably want to have a folder separate just for that. And then, but that's basically it. Oh, I completely forgot about services. The idea is that with the MVC pattern, you would want to use the service folder to handle all the business logic. And what I mean by that is basically, I would put here everything, like inside of the controllers, I would validate my data and then point towards it's like a file corresponding to this specific endpoint inside of the services. So you would have similar files inside of the controllers as inside of the services. That's what I basically mean. So I would create something here like user controller.js, and in my services, I would create user services or service. So basically, when someone makes an API call, it will obviously go to the routes folder, which is where everything starts. It checks for if there was any API calls to that specific route. Then it redirects the logic to the controllers. Inside of the controllers, we would validate information. We would basically just handle the data that we're receiving, and then make a call to the corresponding file in the services folder, which is where we do all the business logic, as I mentioned. And that might include stuff like all the computations, all the requests to the database, that kind of stuff. So I recommend reading up on the MVC model. I can also make a video on it later on. I already have one, but it's very basic. And this is the kind of the idea that I would follow if I were to make an intermediate Express API. So now that we have this done, let's actually look at a pretty advanced folder structure. Okay, guys. So if you are a more advanced programmer, or not advanced programmer, but you're in a more advanced level in regards to building Express APIs, this is the idea. This is what I would do if I were to create a project. This is the structure I would use. So how do I know that this is the structure I would use? It's because I actually work. I work in a startup, and I learned a lot of stuff from them, and also from participating in many different meetings, also working through code that isn't specifically from the startup that I work in. And I learned a lot from what companies actually use in production. So this structure right here would be something that you would use if you were building something that is supposed to be used by a lot of people. So this is the idea, right? This is what you would use if you were to be working with a lot of different people as well in your project, if you were to build something that is supposed to be very scalable, right? So the first thing that you might want to see is that I converted all my project into TypeScript. So yeah, I don't recommend using JavaScript if you're going to build something that actually is worth using TypeScript for, and the sense that if you are working with an initial project, you probably don't want to use TypeScript because it will just set you back some time, especially since you won't be writing a lot of code, right? Both in the intermediate and also in the beginner level, you won't be writing that much code, in the sense that it will cause you issues by not using TypeScript. So in the production level, you'll definitely have a lot of issues because TypeScript saves you a lot of time, with bugs, that kind of stuff. So I definitely recommend using TypeScript. So you would have a tsconfig file over here, which would be where you would configure all of the things you want to configure in regards to TypeScript, right? And also I recommend using something like ESLint to kind of determine how your code is going to run, in the sense that, for example, you don't want to be using double quotes in some parts of your code and also single quotes in some parts of your code. You want to have a standard throughout your whole code, right? And also in the sense of you don't want to put semicolons in some lines of code and not put semicolon in other lines of code. You want to keep it very simple and standardized throughout your whole application. So ESLint saves you time by not only testing for that, but also there's ways you can configure in your application to automatically apply those changes, especially with Prettier, which is another extension that I recommend using in your project. But then what else changes over here? Well, you definitely want to write tests, right? So you want to test most of your logic. So the test folder that I have over here, it won't test any specific logic. It will basically test if your API is setting up correctly, if your API is working correctly. So this is all the overall tests that you want to run in your application. But then if we come here in our SRC, you can see that I made some changes. For example, I divided my API into different versions. For example, if you were to make any changes, you would want to create a different folder for version 2. You want to kind of divide your project into different versions and just make sure that this would change as well in your GitHub repository so that you have an idea of the code from version 1 and the code from version 2. And also I added some stuff. For example, in the configuration folder, you probably want to have some documentation, right? So I love using Swagger. It's what I used in my job, and you're able to document your whole API so that if someone reads or goes to your GitHub profile and just want to read the API, or even a new developer who comes into your application, or if your work is divided into a front-end team and a back-end team, the front-end team really needs to have a clear documentation of what the API of like each API endpoint. So Swagger will help you with that. And also you want to have some stuff like a file just for all the constants you use in your application. Maybe you want to use Logger, which is a library which allows you to improve your capabilities, your console logging capabilities. It's just an advice. I used Logger and I really liked it. And then what else you can do is basically, you can see here in our V1 folder, we added some stuff, especially to TypeScript. For example, you want to have a folder for interfaces if you're using TypeScript, so that you can define all your objects, define all the different kind of structures and types you want to have in your application. And talking about types, I also put inside of it another folder called types, just for types. And the difference for that is I already explained it in another video talking about TypeScript, but this is an idea of how I would basically structure it, right? And then what else did we change here? Well, in each of the controllers and services folder, I also added a tests folder inside of each of them. Why? Because, for example, I want to have a different test file for each of the controllers, and I want to have a different test file for each of the services. The reason for that is because we have a lot of logic inside of it, and I really want to test each endpoint, and this is exactly where I would test them. I would put basically here something like user test. I'm not going to create it, but basically I would create a file here for the tests related to the user, for example. And finally, something that I recommend for actually every single project is being able to, for example, if you have here a folder, and let's say I have here our services folder, right? I don't want to access each file in the services folder directly. What I want to do is I want to create an index.ts in each folder, which basically the only reason why we have this is that it will export everything from this folder right here. And if you're in the sense, if you reached the stage that we are here, then definitely you get what I mean. You want to export all the different files from this folder right here, for example, so that you can easily, if you're going to import something, you can easily import it like this, right? User service, something like this, from /user, not this file, something like you will just access the services folder, and you will automatically be able to get the user service like this. And if I were to create a new service, for example, I were to create the, I don't know, let's imagine that we have a game. I know that doesn't make sense, but a game service.ts, then you would be able to just come over here and get the game service like this. So I would recommend adding an index.ts for each of the folders. And that's basically it, right? This is obviously not what you have to do at all. I remember when I started, I was really interested in learning about folder structures. I don't remember seeing a lot of videos on YouTube, so I wanted to make one. And the thing that I learned throughout my time is that it's not about the folder structure, it's more about the design pattern that you're following. So if you're using MVC, probably your folder structure will be similar to the folder structure of other people who are also using MVC. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. If you learn, if you get to the stage where you are advanced, then you have enough knowledge to basically adapt to any different style or folder structure that a job might require you to. So that's basically it. I really hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you have any questions, please leave it down below. And also, if you have a better option for folder structures, I 100% want to see them. I'm truly interested in looking at how other people structure their projects. So leave a comment down below telling me what you use. And yeah, that's basically it. Subscribe because I'm posting 3 times a week and I respond to everyone in my comments. So I would really appreciate it. And I see you guys next time.